It's late. The sheep are frightened, and they gather around me for protection. Their murmuring is faint and vaguely unsettling, for I fear that they may be sensitive to some things better not spoken of and better not known. Another mind-numbing day has left me exhausted, but I shall try to record my thoughts before I sleep. A slight breeze draws in cold air from the dark hills. The scudding clouds are dark, with beautiful tinges of silver light from the infinite firmament to define and separate them. I sit and contemplate the consequences of the day amidst the babbling sheep. I woke at dawn. Immediately I knew that something was wrong. After dressing quickly, I left my room and went to check on M. He was nowhere to be found. But I found a sheet of paper on the table next to the glasses we left the night before. I picked it up with apprehension. It read, "When you read this letter, I will be gone. I am sorry that it had to be this way, but you will understand as time goes on. I've gone to Glasgow to retrieve the documents I have alluded to in my last letter. My absence will be short, and you should expect me back within 2 days. The letter you read from me was written more than 2 years ago, so you will forgive me for leaving you unexpectedly. But I knew that if I had told you this last night, your anxiety would have been overpowering. There's food in my cottage. You are free to roam about and explore my property. I ask one favor of you, and that is for you to care for my sheep when I am gone. They are easily frightened, and when they are frightened, they become erratic and unpredictable. They have gone out into the hills. I have spoken to them, and they understand that I will be gone. Go out, wander about them, speak to them so that they come to hear and learn the sound of your voice. In the evening when you call, they will come home. Attached to the cottage is a storage room where I keep sacks of oats. Give them oats when they come home. The life of a shepherd is not hard, but it is honorable and it is good. Remember that the Lord was the shepherd, and we are his flock. I look forward to seeing you the day after tomorrow. Be well, M." I was shocked and a little disappointed to read this letter. But then I realized that what he said was true, and that he did not know of my arrival until yesterday when I showed up on his door. But how did he know that I was in Scotland? The driver said that I was expected for dinner. How was that possible? M said that he had to go to Glasgow to communicate with the outside world, so how could I possibly have been expected for supper? I dropped the letter on the table, then decided to forage for something to eat. I will not describe in great detail the inside of his cottage. It was a cottage, simply just a cottage without unnecessary ornamentation. There was a small kitchen area where he could prepare his food He had most of his food stored in large clay containers on top of a large countertop. The containers were filled with staples: oats, barley, rye, sugar, salt, leeks, onions, tea, and other things that I did not even know. He had a storage locker, an ice box, where he kept some things like smoked salmon, smoked bacon, eggs, cheese, bread, and cream, but mostly just essentials. From this discovery, I concluded that M was wise, frugal, and resourceful. I put together a meal and then cleaned up after myself. I decided to go outside and smoke a cigar. I went back to my room and took a cigar, then was about to leave the cottage when I noticed something I was unprepared for. It was a cache of weapons inside a small cabinet near the window I had missed the night before. Unless M had just placed them there before leaving. Shotguns, rifles, small arms, including semi-automatic handguns and boxes of ammunition. I looked, but I did not want to open the cabinet or even touch one. Now, I am trained with firearms, but I was incredulous, for this looked like he was preparing for something, and I did not want to know what that was. Perhaps he was just being cautious, I speculated, and then I left the cottage and breathed in the fresh air with satisfaction. The view from his cottage was intoxicating because of the beauty, the sheer scale, and it is easy to believe that he owned the entire world, for there were no signs of other life, no signs of civilization within sight. Just mist-capped hills, valleys, and luxuriant green verdure all around. I could see the faint outline of his fence that bordered the hillocks to prevent the sheep from plunging off cliffs and into deep crevasses. And I was encouraged by that, as if by seeing this display of care, this level of love, M somehow became a more endearing person in my mind. I walked around to the back of the cottage, and there was an old, ratty shed built beneath an old yew tree. There was a lock on the door, but the lock was not locked. The windows were covered, so I could not see inside. With growing trepidation, I took the lock off the door and entered, slowly. It was very dark, and everything was hidden in shadows. So I went to a window and drew back the dirty, musty curtain in order to bring in some light. There was a large bench in the middle of the shed, filled with components from some peculiar, ancient apparatus, for there were bare wires hanging off all the connections and jumper leads connecting other components strewn all about. The table was a mess. What could this be, I wondered. It looked like something from another century. On the table with wires connected but hanging loosely was what I imagined must be an old battery. But it was not like any battery I'd ever seen before, but more like something from the late 19th century. A voltaic pile, I think it was called, a chemical battery. On the table and pinned to the walls were sheets of paper with weird, frightening symbols on them. These must be what M was speaking about last night, and he had copied them from the book, presumably. This is an old laboratory, I realized. but it had been abandoned quite suddenly, as if in a frenzy after the wires had been torn away. Tools were left rusting amidst the cobwebs and detritus. And then I noticed something out of place. It was an old phonograph, and there was still a record on the turntable, though it was buried beneath a thick layer of dust. I looked closer. There was no label on the record that I could see. The wires had been hastily torn off the phonograph and lay on the floor. My curiosity was piqued, but so was my apprehension. In the end, it was my curiosity that won over. So I spent a few hours playing with the components, trying to connect the phonograph to the battery. When I heard the sound of static, I knew that I was successful. Though I was very uncomfortable with what I was doing, I took the record and cleaned it before placing it back on the turntable. Then I put the needle on the groove and turned on the battery. I don't know what I expected to hear, but I was disappointed by what I did hear. At first, through the scratching sound of the needle being dragged through so much dirt, I heard the sound of noise. But unlike any kind of noise I had ever heard, this was deep, a rumbling like distant thunder. Eerie. I sat down on a stool and tried to concentrate on the sound. Inadvertently, I picked up one of the pieces of paper with the strange symbols and looked at it. Within seconds, something began to happen to me. Something frightening, as if the sound on the record were but a catalyst, and now my mind was susceptible to the fluctuations, the visual topography contained within the symbol. My mind became locked to the symbol, and it drew me closer within the spatial texture being created by the sound from the record. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that something was happening and that I was transforming along with the inner space within an even more vast dimension than the one we know. I was terrified and tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like being held down by powerful hands, though I withered beneath the force. Now the shape of the symbol began to change in my mind. And as the change happened on the paper, so too my mind was being modified by this change, modified to... Suddenly, I fell off the chair and hit the floor hard, banging my head against the hard floor. I was dazed by the impact and lay there for a moment, but it was enough to break the spell to which I had been under. Staggering to my feet, I took the needle off the record to make it stop. My breathing was coming in gasps. I disconnected the machine and left the shed, shutting the door behind me. Then I started walking to clear my mind. After a few minutes, I stopped and sat down, leaning my back against a fence post. Bringing my hands to my head, I felt a deep throbbing, so I closed my eyes and tried to regulate my breathing. Many minutes must have passed, for my next memory is of the presence of sheep. They were all around me, nudging one another to get close to me. "I have nothing for you," I said, just like I was speaking to another person. "Come back later," I said. But they looked at me and they would not leave me alone. Their black, pale faces were dull and without thought. but I could sense a form of consciousness that was very disturbing. I got to my feet and tried to walk away from them, and following the fence alongside the precipice, I left them behind. The fresh air was reviving me, so I continued to walk until I came to a gate. On the other side of the gate was a path made of stones fitted together like an ancient Roman road, leading down into the valley below. So I went through the fence and started to descend into the valley. The further down I went, the more broken and uneven became the path, as if the further one went from the cottage, the less its presence. About 2 miles I walked, and the path now was nothing but packed earth, winding around and through thick bracken and overgrown bushes. And then up ahead at the end of the path, a structure. It was a small inn with a carved sign suspended from heavy brass hinges required in all public houses that said, "The Sheep's Head." I was relieved and headed for it, hoping to find food and drink. The outside was made of dark gray brick and white plaster around large shuttered windows. Flower boxes lined the windows and were filled with various bright flowers, while creeping vines clung to the walls. The walkway was fitted paving stone, leading to a thick door with a brass handle. I went in without hesitation. It was dark, though oil lamps pushed the darkness away from the tables around which several men gathered and sat together. No one spoke when I entered. The bar was long and well stocked with glasses and dozens of conspicuous whiskey bottles on the shelf behind. The bar was polished mahogany, and the landlord wiped it down proudly with a towel. I ordered a pint in a dram, then took my drinks to a table near the window. The beer was fantastic, for the Scots are proud of their strong ales. I looked across the room. The men were staring at me. They stared for a long time and would not look away. Finally, one of the men spoke up. He pointed to a guitar nestled in a guitar stand near the fireplace. "Can you play that thing, mate?" he asked. I smiled, slightly embarrassed, for I did not think he would like to hear the things I like to do with a guitar. "Come on now, mate," he said again. "Play us something." I tried to tell them that I did not think they would like my music, but they would not relent. "Play us a song now, mate," they all said, for they were convinced that I would give in to their demand. In the end, I did give in. I walked to the guitar and picked it up. It was slightly out of tuning, so I tuned it up. They all cheered. "We knew you could play," they all laughed together. No, I was nervous. I do not play in front of other people unless I have to, and this is the exact reason. I do not know anything. I do not learn songs. No, I am a studio musician, and I write music only for myself. But I knew that I had to make the most of it and have some fun, if only just to take my mind off of the incredible experience I had just went through. Finally, I was ready. I struck a single chord. It was an E7 sharp 9 chord, the Hendrix chord as it is come to be known. The sound of the guitar was rich, so I struck it again. Now there are no songs that are written using this chord as a root, so I started to improvise using a finger-picking style I've done my entire life. This is also not fundamental, but is a hybrid, an improvisation without structure. I think I went to an A chord, but then I don't remember. And I went back and forth to a type of B7 chord. I was just having fun, doing what I always do at home when I'm alone. Then I went back and played the Hendrix chord again, and then again, and I held onto that chord rhythmically. And then suddenly I began to sing. The words were on my tongue even before I finished forming them, for this was completely spontaneous. The beating of the heart is like the beating of a drum, a chanting voice that whispers in our dreams. The rhythm of the world is like the rhythm of our blood, a chanting voice that whispers in our veins. I ended the song with a 12th fret E harmonic, and then I looked up. They were staring at me. No one smiled. No one even uttered a word. They just stared at me, trying to decide what they even thought of it. Then one of the men smiled and motioned me with his finger. I went over to the table. He took a glass and wiped it off on his shirt. Then he poured a glass of whiskey from a bottle and handed it to me. He raised his glass. I raised mine, and then we both drank down the glass in a single gulp. After that, I was their hero. I sat down at their table and they quickly poured me another dram, and I downed that too. And then one of the men started talking. He was telling a story. It started out as a story about a man who was dragged from his home and torn apart by monsters. But then I heard another voice speaking as if more than one was speaking at once. The whiskey was beginning to affect me, I thought. I continued to listen, and I heard fragments of tales about werewolves and sea monsters, wizards and demons, hidden passages, hidden doors, hidden meanings, vapors, water spouts, and much more that I can't even remember. The stories were coming from all directions, merging and interconnecting with different and obscure collections of folklore. I was having a hard time paying attention as my mind drifted from one story to the next. But then I realized that by accident, or by purpose, they were doing the same thing to me as I did to them. They were improvising. I listened until my mind was numb, and then I stood up to leave and almost fell to the floor before I grabbed the table to stabilize myself. I told them that I was all right and that I would come back tomorrow, but that I had important things to do and that I must leave. Then I went to the door and outside into the gloaming. After walking around the outside of the inn, I found the path to take me back to the cottage, and I set off for the long walk back again. The entire walk back I felt dizzy, but I was going and did not stop. When I went through the gate, it was almost dark, but there was still enough light for me to find the storage room next to the cottage where the oats were kept. I tried not to look at the shed, which was right there, taunting me, demanding to be noticed. I got the bag of oats and went out to the field to call the sheep. On the top of the promontory, I threw down the bag of oats and tried to call the sheep, but I did not know what to say to them. After calling and calling for some time, I grew tired and sat down to rest. I awoke in almost total darkness. The sheep were huddled all around me as if they were frightened. "Do not be afraid," I told them calmly, and the sound of my voice seemed to calm them slightly. Then I took out the oats and scattered them on the ground before them. The sheep munched and nosed around looking for more, and I could hear their voices like a forgotten language. Near exhaustion, I sat on the ground and leaned up against the fence post. I continued to watch the sheep and to listen to them. The sound was mesmerizing and somewhat frightening, for suddenly I thought that I could understand them. The soft baying was comforting to me, almost as if the sheep were lulling me into a place of solace, a place of safety, shepherding me. The night air was cool and felt good against my face. The quietude seemed almost unnatural. A shiver went up my back, for I suddenly came to realize that the noise was inside the quietude, the silence, and that it was building, becoming part of my consciousness. The noise was all around me now, swirling around me like a vortex. The sound was changing, becoming more and more sinister, creepy. It was the sound of the record that was trying to break through my barrier of will, my resistance. Suddenly I was terrified and I started to pray. But the more I prayed, the more frightened the sheep became until I could stand it no longer. Suddenly I shouted as loud as I was capable. The sheep stopped murmuring, and the night air became quiet and still. I am very tired. I have been drinking all day, and I can barely stay awake. But there is one more thing for me to say so that I do not forget it. It has to do with a strange thought that is beginning to form in my mind. Now, scientists are smart people, and they control a vast amount of esoteric knowledge that the average person does not even think about. They gather together in large universities and think tanks and give lectures in front of academic elites, all of it far above the capability of the average person to understand. I count myself as one of these people, but I am stubborn and I refuse to ignore it. Scientists work with numbers, filling complete blackboards with equations and erudite speculations. One of the ongoing debates is the nature of dark matter. Scientists measure and calculate observable conditions in order to attach these ideas to the mathematical foundation on which they are built. But sometimes the observable conditions do not match the results of their elegant mathematical formula, and that is a problem. Speed and acceleration are important factors in these equations, and if the equation is elegant, then the results must follow. But they don't. Lord Kelvin was the first to calculate the density of our galaxy by the velocity dispersion of the stars orbiting the center. but the numbers were not even close, and he estimated that most of our universe was made up of dark bodies, dark matter. Spiral arms of galaxies can be calculated by estimating the mass, but the mass was not there. New theories were constructed to explain the discrepancies, including gravitational lensing and black hole entropy. But I'm losing my train of thought here. I'm beginning to wonder if this mystifying sound I heard is just this dark matter, and that behind our observable universe is an almost incomprehensible universe of machinery. Machinery for controlling and recording everything that ever happens to everything that has ever existed. Every creature makes a sound. We all leave behind an imprint, no matter how small or large. It's still an imprint, like the scratching of a needle across an old phonograph, around and around and around for infinity. Everything makes a sound, every creature, every person. Everything makes a sound. It's the sound of the world. We put ourselves down on a record and it goes around and scratches its way through reality. Everything makes a sound. And the record of everything is stored in some vast collection, some library where the great collector pulls out a record every now and then and listens to it and smiles. I did not want to go back to the cottage, for I was too horrified by what had just happened. To calm my raw nerves, I took out my phone and recorded this entry. My third day in Scotland.